I crouched inside my battered tent, stirring embers in a meager fire that barely held back the frigid night. The sound of relentless wind and swirling snow had become a lullaby to me over the past months, ever since I'd set off on my own. Once, people said this world had been warm. Lush fields, forests alive with color, cities bright with electric lights that never flickered. Now all of that was gone. A memory as fragile as the half-burned newspapers that I used to keep my fire going. I only survived by scavenging among frozen ruins, hunting timid creatures desperate to live as I did and praying that each night in the cold would not be my last. I was on edge that evening. The snowstorm outside had started earlier than usual, as if nature was determined to remind me it could crush me at any moment. Wind slapped against the tent walls in vicious, repeated gusts. My breath formed pale clouds in front of my face whenever I exhaled, and I had to rub my hands together to keep some feeling in my fingers. Over time, I'd grown used to surviving in the wreckage, forging a life from scraps of civilization. My biggest concern was always to remain unseen, avoid needless fights. There were others out there, desperate, armed, and often cruel. When the temperature dropped low enough, it made us no better than beasts. I had no intention of letting anyone find me, at least not while I was alone and half-frozen, so I was startled to hear a muffled step against the packed snow outside my tent. It was soft, barely discernible over the wind, but it was there, a hesitant, uneven shuffle. My heart lurched. I reached for the battered hunting rifle by my side and doused the small flames with a handful of dirt, plunging the tent into near darkness. My survival instincts took hold, and I bit down on a shuddering breath, trying to steady my pulse. A silhouette shuffled into view beyond the tent flap, outlined against the faint glow of a moon hidden somewhere behind thick clouds. For a moment I assumed it was a scavenger or a lost wanderer. Maybe someone so desperate they'd risk robbing me in the middle of a blizzard. But then the figure took a shaky step closer, and I caught a glimpse of skin. Skin unlike any human's. It was tinted a pale violet, almost glowing, as if some faint luminescence flickered beneath the surface. The figure collapsed to its knees, and I realized with a jolt that this being, whoever she was, would freeze to death if I didn't do something. Every instinct told me to keep the flap closed, to stay silent, to protect whatever meager supplies I had left. The world was merciless now, with no guarantee that a traveler was friend rather than foe. But something in my chest, something that hadn't entirely died, refused to let me ignore the limp form. I unzipped the tent and pulled her inside. She was light, alarmingly so, and ice clung to her hair. Her body was cold against my arms, not the normal chill of a human in winter, but a deeper, more frightening sort of cold, as though her blood itself had turned to frost. I laid her on my only spare blanket and covered her with my coat. Even through my gloved hands I could feel the trembling of her chest, the ragged intake of breath. She wore what looked like a ruined bodysuit, sleek black material with tears and burns across it, dotted with silver lines that might have once been functional. Her face was narrow, with high cheekbones that gave her an unearthly sort of beauty. Her lips were parted, and wisps of fog escaped each time she exhaled. For a moment I just stared. It had been ages since I'd encountered any alien presence. Long ago, before the wars and the plagues, the visitors from the stars had arrived with a promise of hope. But war was our default. We turned on each other, and eventually on them. Those who survived insisted the aliens vanished, leaving our planet to tear itself apart. This woman must have been one of the few who never escaped. Or so I assumed. She wasn't going to last long like this. I remembered from old rumors that aliens could have certain vulnerabilities in our atmosphere. She needed warmth, and quickly. I relit the fire with shaky hands, careful not to burn my limited fuel supply. The storm outside howled louder, as if protesting my decision to intervene. But I couldn't let her die. I fed the flames, and as their glow rose, I saw her eyelids flutter. Her breathing hitched and her fingers twitched. Then her eyes opened and I froze at the sight. They were violet, deep and luminous, reflecting the flicker of the fire like polished glass. She gazed at me, confusion and wariness etched into her expression. I tried to speak, but my mind stumbled over the right words. Her response was immediate. Her hand darted out, catching me off guard as she snatched my own knife from my belt. The blade's tip quivered against my throat. She was trembling, obviously drained, but her hold was steady in a way that spoke of intense training or desperation. Or both. "Hey," I rasped, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender. "You'll freeze to death if you leave now. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer. Her pupils were dilated and fear, no, more like raw survival instinct, radiated from her posture. Slowly, I motioned toward the small pot of water warming near the fire. "It's just water," I murmured. "You can drink." "I won't poison you." She hesitated, eyes flicking between me and the knife. Her gaze settled on the pot. Reluctantly, she lowered the blade, though not entirely. I exhaled a shaky breath. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. "I'm Elias," I managed, voice subdued. "What's your name?" She regarded me with a slight tilt of her head as though trying to parse whether I was worthy of a response. Then, in a voice that quivered with cold, she said, "Air. Air." A single word, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. She wasn't human. Her accent, her tone, something about it felt different, resonant in my ears. "Okay," I said, swallowing back anxiety. "Air, you're hurt, let me help." She flinched at the gesture and kept the knife angled in my direction. I couldn't blame her for the lack of trust. This world had taught us all to expect betrayal. With utmost caution, I inched the water pot closer. She didn't break eye contact. Her entire body coiled like a wounded animal's. "There's a storm outside," I said softly. "It's not letting up anytime soon. If you go, you'll die. If you stay, at least you'll have a chance." I made no sudden moves, just nudged the pot toward her. She stared at the steam curling above the surface, then at me, and finally lowered her chin. With her free hand, she scooped a small tin cup from my pack and poured water. She sniffed it first, cautious, then swallowed. When she closed her eyes, relief washed over her face in the form of a slow, shuddering breath. We didn't speak again for a long time. She let me check her burns, and I realized they were not just the result of the cold, but also from some kind of combat or explosion. Parts of her bodysuit were fused to her skin at the edges, and though I didn't possess advanced medical supplies, I did what I could with antiseptic from my battered first aid kit. Her body was unbelievably light in my arms, as though gravity weighed her down less. Maybe it was some quirk of her physiology. The storm continued to rage, but Ira's breathing steadied a fraction once we had the fire stoked. I caught glimpses of her violet eyes drifting shut, her posture sagging in exhaustion. Eventually, the adrenaline in my blood began to recede. My arms and neck felt stiff, partly from tension, partly from the near-constant chill. I rested against the side of the tent, daring only to close my eyes for a moment. A clatter jolted me awake. The knife was on the floor, near her hand, but she wasn't reaching for it. Instead, she'd tried to shift position and inadvertently knocked it off the makeshift blanket. I blinked blearily, realizing the night must have gone on for hours. Outside, the wind no longer roared as violently. My stomach cramped with hunger, so I offered her a piece of dried meat from my supply. She eyed it with visible distrust. Then she took it, bit off a corner and chewed, her gaze never leaving me. I fed a bit more fuel to the fire, rummaging through my pack. My mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was she running from? Why was she left behind? Did she pose a threat to me? Yet despite my anxiety, something else buzzed in the back of my mind, a tattered remnant of empathy I thought I'd lost. She was alone, clearly wounded. If I turned her out, I'd be consigning her to die. And I'd seen enough death. She allowed me to approach again, though she tensed at every movement. I gently reached for her wrist and checked her pulse. It felt too weak, too fast. "I don't have much," I said quietly, "but I'll do what I can. You can stay until you're better, but after that we'll see." She regarded me, her expression an odd mix of suspicion and relief. Something flickered in her eyes, something like gratitude. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she murmured, "Thank you." She said it with careful precision, as though each syllable was foreign on her tongue. I just nodded, uncertain of how else to respond. I dozed intermittently, jolting awake at every shift or sigh Era made. By the time gray light seeped into the edges of the tent, the storm had died down, and she was asleep, her face turned away from me. Her violet skin glowed faintly in the dawn, mesmerizing in a way I couldn't explain. A day ago I might have laughed at the suggestion that I'd ever see an alien again. Now she was less than an arm's length away, alive and breathing, dependent on me for survival. When she finally stirred, her eyes flicked open and she sat up so abruptly she nearly toppled forward. I grabbed her shoulders to steady her, expecting her to lash out again, but she didn't. She glanced from me to the tent opening. "You saved me?" I lowered my hands slowly. "Yeah," I said. "Don't read too much into it." I'm not sure it was the smartest decision. A faint crease appeared between her eyebrows, and she exhaled. "I will not forget." I attempted a half smile. "Good," I said, "because I'm not sure I can let you forget that you nearly put a knife to my throat." Her cheeks darkened. A different shade of violet, before she looked away, almost embarrassed. I decided not to push the subject further. We sat there for a while in awkward silence, sharing the last of my water. The wind outside had subsided, but the cold remained, pressing in on us like an invisible force. I realized the tent wouldn't withstand another storm like the last. We needed to move. But I had no idea where to go. My usual routine of scavenging in the same battered district was dangerous enough on my own. With her, and with whatever enemies might be chasing her, it could turn lethal. Eventually she shifted as though testing the strength in her muscles. I said, "Ira, did you mention you're being hunted? Or you said something about being left behind? Which is it?" Her jaw tensed. "They left me," she said, voice a mixture of anger and resignation. "But now they want to erase me." When I didn't reply, she continued, "My people had a protocol. Anyone who breaks from the plan is disposable." I rubbed my forehead. "And you broke from the plan?" A brief flash of pain crossed her features. "I refused certain orders. I tried to help humans at a time we were told not to interfere. It was considered treason. When the last transport left Earth, I wasn't on it." The weight of her words pressed upon me. Humanity had done plenty of damage to itself. But I never realized the alien visitors turned on their own for associating with us. She pulled the ragged edges of the blanket closer to her body, and I could see faint lines of scarring on her arms. "Well, I guess I can relate to being stranded," I said. "I was a soldier. After my squad was wiped out, I stuck around, wandering from one ruin to the next. At some point it felt pointless to keep running." I hesitated. "Then you showed up." She looked at me with a gaze that hinted at empathy, maybe understanding. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what you lost." I let out a short laugh. "Yeah, well, I'm sorry you got left behind by your people." I studied her face, seeing just how gaunt she was. "We should get going," I murmured. "This tent. I doubt it'll last another night. We'll need shelter, food, maybe a place with actual walls." She nodded, swallowing. "I can walk." "You sure?" She nodded again, stubbornness flickering across her features. I wondered if it was pride that kept her from admitting how badly she was hurt. But we didn't have much of a choice. Our resources were nearly gone, and the stormy season was only getting worse. I packed up my supplies. Very few, mostly scraps of dried meat, a half-empty canteen, a battered rifle. Ira said little as she watched me, her expression pensive. We stepped outside into a desolate landscape. The sky was a deep gray, the ground covered in fresh snow. Rusted frames of vehicles and collapsed buildings surrounded us. It had been some kind of residential district years ago, the kind of place families might have lived normal lives. Now it was an ice-bound graveyard. Era hissed softly as the cold bit her face, and she clutched the remains of her suit tighter around her shoulders. I silently draped my spare jacket over her. She didn't protest. We started walking. My boots crunched through crusted snow, and her lighter footsteps followed close behind. My instincts told me to keep my rifle ready in case of trouble. People or wild animals, it didn't matter. Both could kill without hesitation for the sake of a meal or a place to hide. In the distance, the silhouette of a toppled skyscraper jutted into the sky, a jagged reminder of how far humanity had fallen. Era's voice, muffled by the scarf I gave her, reached my ears. "You have a destination?" "Not really," I admitted. "I know there's a set of underground bunkers a few miles from here, but it might be infested with ferals or raiders. Plus, there's talk of radiation pockets." I saw her expression tighten, and I sighed. "But it's better than freezing out in the open, or waiting for your enemies to find us." She glanced around, scanning the horizon. "I know a place as well, an old outpost left behind by my people. I'm not sure what remains, but it's not too far from here, I think." Uncertainty tinged her voice, as though she didn't trust her own memory. "We can try either, or both," I said. "Let's see how far we can get before dark." We trudged on, occasionally finding half-buried wreckage that gave us a modicum of shelter. The day wore on with glacial slowness. Our conversation was sparse. Era revealed she hadn't expected to survive the first winter after the Exodus. She described how she'd once possessed an advanced suit that regulated her body temperature and oxygen intake, but that suit was all but ruined in an explosion. She avoided questions about who caused the explosion or how it happened. The haunted look in her eyes told me not to pry. Over an hour into our trek, we stumbled upon a cluster of collapsed buildings. They were mostly rubble now, but a portion of one remained standing, perhaps an old convenience store. I pointed it out to Era, and she nodded. We forced open the half-frozen door. Inside, the stench of decay and stale air made us both recoil, but it was at least somewhat sheltered from the wind. I used my rifle's butt to rummage through debris, broken shelving, shattered glass, rotting crates. Era searched near the back, her violet skin standing out in the dimness. She let out a soft sound of triumph, coming away with 2 dusty cans. The labels were worn off, so we didn't know exactly what we'd be eating. Beans, soup, maybe dog food. But it was nourishment. I found a rusted crowbar and pried open a locked storage room. Ira followed, and we discovered a battered generator, obviously long out of service. There were some crates filled with moldy supplies, none of which looked edible or salvageable. Still, we managed to unearth a small stash of old, freeze-dried meals, human rations of some sort. They might have been there for decades, but beggars couldn't be choosers. We made camp in what was once the staff room, where the walls still stood intact. I set about clearing debris to create a space for us. Era coughed a bit, raising her scarf over her mouth to filter the dust. I felt a pang of concern, but she waved off my worried look. We heated water in an old metal pot we'd found, mixing it with the rations to create a lukewarm, bland stew. The taste barely qualified as food, but it was better than starvation. It might have been my imagination, but Era seemed to savor every bite, as if she hadn't eaten in weeks. When we'd eaten our fill, I leaned back against the wall, wincing as a bruise on my shoulder throbbed from the earlier journey. Ira watched me with those intense violet eyes. "So, you're a soldier," she said softly. "Used to be," I replied. "A long time ago. Doesn't mean much these days." Her gaze drifted to the insignia patch I'd kept inside my jacket. "You still carry that," she observed. I shrugged. Old habit, a reminder of who I used to be, maybe. Silence settled between us for a moment. The wind had picked up again outside, whistling through cracks in the walls. My breath ghosted into the air in a translucent puff. Eric closed her eyes, leaning her head back. "I had friends too," she murmured. "Comrades, but we were separated. They left me or I left them. I suppose the difference is trivial now." I watched her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. Her skin had regained a bit of color, but she was still far from healthy. "You're not alone anymore," I heard myself say. The words sounded strange, echoing in the near darkness. She opened her eyes, surprise flickering across her features. "I know," she said quietly. "You saved me, But it isn't safe to stay with me. It might cost you your life. Seems to me, I said, we'll both die a lot faster if we stay isolated. The world's not exactly forgiving. Besides, it's not like I have anything else to lose. She looked at me then, really looked, as if measuring the sincerity in my voice. After a moment, she just nodded, as if acknowledging a silent agreement. Her posture relaxed a fraction, and she let out a long breath. I felt a fleeting warmth somewhere beneath my chest. Maybe companionship wasn't entirely lost in this broken place. We took turns keeping watch, although nothing disturbed us that night, except the groan of shifting beams. Morning dawned bleak and pale, painting everything in lifeless grays. We gathered our meager belongings and set out again. Era insisted we try to find the old alien outpost. She believed there might be advanced equipment left behind that we could salvage, perhaps even technology to help us survive the harsh climate. The journey tested us more than the previous day. The chill seeped through layers of clothing, biting into my bones. My mind began to wander, recalling fragments of my old life. I had once lived in a city filled with light and possibility. I had enlisted, believing I could protect it. But the wars that followed the alien arrivals tore everything apart. We fought ourselves as much as we fought them, and by the time the dust settled, we were all but extinct. For a while I had wandered in a daze, uncertain why I kept going. Now, at least, I had a purpose, to get Era, and maybe myself, some kind of chance at a future. We caught sight of drone tracks by midday. They were not footprints, but irregular depressions in the snow, the sign of small reconnaissance devices that hovered just above ground level. Era crouched beside them, her lips pressed in a thin line. "They're searching for me," she said under her breath. I scanned the horizon, half expecting to see metallic shapes rising against the sky. "Then we'd better keep moving." She nodded, her expression tight. We pressed on. Each time the wind howled, I tensed, expecting to see mechanical scouts cresting a snowdrift. My rifle felt heavier in my hands as anxiety built. Era was pale, her face drawn from the strenuous walk, but she pushed herself forward relentlessly. Late in the afternoon, the terrain gave way to a field of craggy ice formations like a frozen sea of waves. Navigating it was tricky, and we had to test each step to avoid hidden crevasses. Era's foot slipped on a patch of slick ice, and I lunged, catching her around the waist. She let out a startled gasp as I pulled her back. For a moment our gazes locked, the closeness making my heart pound in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She quickly looked away, cheeks darkening that faint violet hue. "Thank you," she said softly. I nodded, swallowing a tightness in my throat. We found a small cove in the ice where the wind was slightly less brutal. I set down my pack, rummaging for anything we could use to make a temporary camp. My supply of fire-starting materials had dwindled, but I managed to spark a modest flame against a mound of loose rock and ice. We huddled around it, pressing our hands to the limited warmth. Era broke the silence first. "I appreciate what you're doing," she said, voice low. "I know how much risk you're taking." I shrugged. "You're taking a risk being near me too. I might not be worth saving, but here we are." She studied the flickering fire, her face illuminated by shifting orange light. "I can't do this alone anymore," she admitted. "I tried. I got this far and I thought I'd die in the snow. It was better than the alternative." Something in her tone twisted my gut. "You mean letting them capture you?" I asked. She nodded. "They don't take prisoners. They make you disappear, in every sense." The gravity of her words hung between us. Even in a world as ruined as ours, the idea of being systematically erased by your own people carried a certain horror. "That's not going to happen," I said, more firmly than I felt. "We'll figure something out." She exhaled, her breath a shaky plume of vapor. "Elias, you're a strange human." I huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, so I've been told." For a moment the corners of her mouth curved, almost a smile. Then she turned away, crossing her arms against the cold. The wind rattled the ice walls around us like a warning. Sighing, I poked at the fire, wishing for once that I had something better to burn than scraps of cloth. The meager flame flickered precariously as if mirroring our chance at survival. That night I barely slept. Fear curled in my stomach and the cold gnawed at every exposed inch of skin. Era dozed fitfully beside me, occasionally jerking awake, her eyes wide and alarmed. I wondered if she was seeing nightmares or remembering some past betrayal. Either way, I tried to murmur reassurances, though I wasn't sure she believed them. Eventually, the exhaustion overcame us both, and I drifted off, with her body pressed lightly against mine, our combined warmth the only comfort. I woke to the hum. It was subtle at first, blending with the wind, but then it grew louder, more insistent. My eyes snapped open and I stiffened. Era was already awake, her posture tense. She looked at me, her lips forming the words before her voice caught up. Drones. My blood ran cold. We kicked snow over the dying fire and gathered our packs, hearts pounding. The sound was coming from somewhere above, echoing off the ice. We scrambled to hide behind a jagged ridge, pressing ourselves flat. My pulse roared in my ears. If these were the same devices that had tracked Era before, then we were in deep trouble. A metal shape skittered into view overhead, scanning with a bright red beam. It was about the size of a large dog, sleek and insect-like. Its sensor array glowed eerily. A second drone appeared moments later, weaving a search pattern through the ice gullies. Ira gripped my arm, her eyes full of anxiety. I nodded slowly, trying to control my breathing. If those sensors caught even a hint of heat signature, we'd be pinned. We waited, motionless. The drones hovered, scanning. Then one let out a shrill ping and changed course. It was heading directly for our position. I mouthed a silent oath. We'd been spotted. With no time to debate, I raised my rifle, aimed, and fired. The shot slammed into the drone's side, sending sparks flying. It spiraled out of control and crashed in a burst of metal shards. The second drone whirled, opening fire with an energy pulse that scorched the ice behind us. Era hissed in pain as fragments of ice pelted her cheek, but she launched into action, producing a small alien device from her belt. Before I could ask what it did, she pressed it, and a brief electromagnetic pulse rattled the air. The remaining drone's lights flickered, then died, and it dropped to the ground in a clatter. For a moment, silence reigned. My heart hammered. Era's chest rose and fell in rapid gasps. Then I heard another sound, a distant thrumming that made my veins run icy. She froze at the same moment I did. Something bigger was approaching, something that vibrated the very air around us. We scrambled over the nearest ridge, pressing ourselves against a shelf of ice, and peeked out. A black ship descended from the sky like a monstrous bird of prey. It hovered in the gloom, engine thrusters kicking up a swirl of snow. My stomach sank. The ship looked far more advanced than anything I'd seen humans wield. It bore markings in a language I recognized from old alien transmissions. A ramp extended, and heavily armored figures stepped out, forming a perimeter. Their exosuits glowed with integrated power cells, and each carried weapons that crackled with lethal energy. My rifle felt puny by comparison. Leading them was a tall figure who didn't wear a full helmet. Instead, he had a face etched with scars, and eyes that flashed silver under the dismal light. His gaze swept across the ice, unerringly landing on the broken drones. Then his lips curled into a sneer. Era's grip on my sleeve tightened. "Commander Rose," she whispered, and I felt the tremor in her voice. I tensed. "Your people?" She nodded. "They came for me." We pressed ourselves flatter against the ice, not daring to move. Ross surveyed the wreckage for a moment, then gave sharp orders to his soldiers. They spread out with mechanical precision, scanning the area. My mind raced. We were outnumbered and outgunned, pinned between lethal commandos and a harsh environment. There was no easy escape. Era leaned close, her breath warm against my ear. "I can disable some of their gear if we get close enough," she whispered, "but they'll detect me before that. We'll need a distraction." My throat felt dry. "I can provide one," I said, "but if I don't make it back?" She shook her head vehemently, eyes blazing. "No! We escape together, or not at all." The fierce determination in her face, combined with a trace of desperation, made my chest constrict. "All right," I muttered, checking the rifle's magazine. "Let's do this." Before my mind could fully register the suicidal nature of the plan, I burst from cover, sprinting across the ice toward the nearest soldier. Shouts rose in an alien tongue and plasma bolts zipped overhead. My boots skidded and I dove behind a formation of ice, returning fire. The bullet pinged uselessly off the soldier's armor. They advanced, methodical, forming a flank. One raised a weapon that charged with a high-pitched whine. I barely rolled aside before the energy blast melted a chunk of ice at my previous position. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw Era dart between formations, her live movements surprisingly swift despite her weakened condition. She flanked them from another angle, producing that same handheld device she'd used on the drones. Another electromagnetic shockwave pulsed. One soldier's suit flickered, and he let out a garbled shout as the power cells shorted, sending arcs of energy across his armor. He collapsed, but the others shifted their formation, adjusting too fast. I fired again, aiming at a gap in a soldier's helmet seal. The shot struck true and he staggered. Then Commander Rose himself moved in, raising an energy blade that glowed with a deep violet hue. He spotted me behind my meager cover. With a snarl, he lunged, slicing through the ice like it was warm butter. I threw myself backward, heart hammering. This was no normal soldier. He radiated an air of authority and deadly skill. Ara emerged from behind him, her own improvised weapon at the ready. But Roz anticipated it. He whirled, striking out with a lightning-fast blow that knocked the device from her hand. She cried out as sparks flew, her eyes widening in alarm. I tried to get a shot, but the angle was all wrong. Desperation flared. If Roz reached her, she'd be done for. I roared, leaping forward, rifle butt swinging toward his head. He dodged with inhuman speed, driving an elbow into my ribs. Pain exploded, and I stumbled, gasping. Before I could recover, he slashed with the energy blade. It grazed my side, sending a jolt of searing heat through my nerves. I collapsed to one knee, vision swimming. Era launched herself at him, brandishing a knife she'd somehow managed to keep. He deflected it effortlessly, hooking her arm and tossing her aside. She hit the ground hard, a strangled sound of pain escaping her lips. I coughed, spitting a string of curses as I tried to stand. Blade humming ominously. He fixed me with a cold, superior stare. "You helped her," he said in accented but understandable human speech. "A foolish choice." I gritted my teeth, refusing to look away. "Funny," I gasped. "That's what everyone tells me." He raised the blade and I braced for the end. But Ira cried out, "No!" Her voice rang with such anguish that for an instant Roz's motion faltered. In that heartbeat of hesitation, I thrust my rifle muzzle forward, jamming it up into the gap beneath his breastplate. I pulled the trigger. The discharge roared and Roz staggered, his expression twisting with fury and shock. Smoke rose from the wound, but it wasn't enough to kill him. He struck me with the hilt of his blade and I reeled backward, blood pounding in my ears. Era found her footing, ignoring the pain that must have lanced through her body, and scrambled for the device she'd dropped. Rose, clutching his wounded side, growled something in an alien language. The remaining soldiers converged, but Era slammed her palm down on the device, unleashing another disruptive wave. Several suits shorted out, sparks flew. One soldier's weapon exploded in a shower of energy. In that instant, I realized our one chance to end this was to destroy their ship before reinforcements poured out. With trembling arms, I fumbled for the improvised explosive charges in my pack, the ones I'd never expected to use. I jammed them together, flicking the primer. The beep signaled a short fuse. "Ira!" I shouted, waving her toward the ship's hull. We sprinted as best we could, weaving around the half-destroyed soldiers. Rose roared behind us, ignoring his own injuries. A plasma shot tore past me, nearly blasting me off my feet. But we reached the ship's side, where the power relay glowed a faint blue. My trembling fingers slapped the charges onto the metal. The blinking red light on the detonator started counting down. 5 seconds. 4. We ran. A thunderous explosion ripped through the air, engulfing part of the ship in flames. The force knocked us flat. My ears rang and shards of debris rained down. I curled myself around Era, shielding her with my body as best I could. Another series of blasts reverberated as the fuel lines ignited. Smoke billowed into the sky, the ground beneath us shook, and the ship listed heavily, thrusters spewing sparks. The soldiers who could still move scrambled away, but some were trapped by collapsing metal. Ross himself vanished amid the choking smoke. For a long moment all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the hiss of white-hot flames consuming twisted metal. Then I felt Era stir beneath me. She was breathing, albeit shallowly. I gently helped her sit up, wincing at the pain in my side. A dark patch of blood stained my clothing where the energy blade had caught me. Adrenaline still roared in my veins, keeping me conscious. "We have to get out of here," I rasped, pulling her to her feet. She nodded, eyes dazed, and leaned heavily on me. The fires illuminated the ice field in a ghastly orange glow, as if the apocalypse itself had flared back to life around us. We staggered away from the wreck, stumbling over chunks of debris. In the distance, I glimpsed some of the alien soldiers in disarray, perhaps retreating. The ship's engines whined, then failed with a final crash, lodging the vessel into the ice. Neither of us could muster words until we were a safe distance away. Finally, we collapsed behind a large, half-buried piece of concrete, panting. My entire body felt like one massive bruise. But we were alive. Era clutched my hand, trembling. I squeezed back, my throat tight. She looked at me, violet eyes reflecting the distant flames. Her breath hitched. "Thank you," she whispered. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling tears threaten at the corners of my eyes. I think we both saved each other. We huddled there for what felt like hours, letting the raging fires subside. The night was bitter cold, but somehow less terrifying than before, as if the threat that loomed over us had finally been silenced. Era eventually nudged me, pointing to the north. "We should keep moving," she said softly, voice hoarse. "I know a place with trees." I blinked. "Trees?" She nodded. "A valley. Warmer, maybe. My memory is incomplete, but I recall it being untouched." It sounded like a fantasy. Still, I shrugged. "Lead the way." We traveled for days, though I was never sure how many. The wound in my side ached, but Ira helped me treat it, using some alien ointment from a small capsule she'd salvaged from her belt. She was healing too, though I could see the exhaustion in her every step. The thought that she might have used the last of her advanced medical supply on me made something in my chest tighten with gratitude I couldn't express. Our path led us across barren plains where skeletal trees jutted from frozen soil, across a ruined highway where old vehicles lay rusted and half-buried, and finally through a narrow mountain pass that had become thick with ice. We scrambled over boulders and snowdrifts, spurred by the faint hope that there was truly something better on the other side. On the final day of our journey, as we crested a ridge, my breath caught. Stretching before us was a secluded valley, shrouded by cliffs that broke the worst of the wind. There were trees, actual living conifers, dusted with snow but still green. I almost doubted my eyes, certain it was a mirage. But Ira squeezed my arm, sharing my amazement. The valley floor seemed less pounded by storms, and I thought I saw a trickle of running water where the ice had melted into a stream. We descended carefully, our hearts in our throats. The air grew noticeably milder, not warm by the standards of the old world, perhaps, but enough that my breath no longer formed clouds with every exhale. The scent of pine reached me, stirring memories of a childhood trip to a forest that had long since vanished. When we reached the bottom, I touched the trunk of a tree, half expecting it to crumble. But it was solid, alive. Era stepped away, turning in a slow circle, taking in the quiet majesty of this place. "It's real," she breathed, awe dripping from every syllable. Her violet skin, so stark against snow and ash, seemed to glow with renewed vitality in the gentle light. My chest felt tight again, but this time it was from something akin to hope. We set down our things near a small clearing. The ground here wasn't covered in a thick blanket of snow, just a thin layer that crunched underfoot. We found a spot by a stream where the water still trickled, cold but not frozen solid. I cupped my hands and drank, relishing the clean taste. This was more than I'd dared wish for in ages. Era joined me, kneeling to drink. The tension that had lined her face for so long seemed to ease. When she straightened, a stray beam of sunlight pierced the clouds and illuminated her features, revealing exhaustion and something else. Something like peace. I realized that for the first time since I met her, I could see her relaxed. She noticed me looking and offered a tentative smile. It was a small, fragile thing, but it stole my breath. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then I rasped, "I think we can build shelter here, maybe find food that isn't freeze-dried rations. We might survive." She nodded, stepping closer, and I could sense a mixture of relief and uncertainty radiating off her. "I'm tired of running," she whispered, "tired of being alone, but I still fear they could come back." "Maybe they will," I admitted, though I doubt anyone survived that explosion except a few stragglers. "But you're not alone, Ira. I'm here." The words felt heavy, laden with a promise that went beyond mere survival. I reached for her hand, and this time she didn't flinch. Our fingers intertwined, warm flesh against warm flesh, bridging the gap between two species that once went to war. She leaned her forehead against my shoulder, letting out a long breath that sounded close to a sob. I held her, unsure of how else to offer comfort, only knowing I wanted to. The hush of the wind through the pines enveloped us, carrying the lingering scent of sap and fresh water, a combination I hadn't experienced in a long time. We spent that evening gathering what driftwood and fallen branches we could find, constructing a rough shelter near a rocky overhang. I hammered stakes into the ground with a stone, wincing every time my ribs twinged. Ara tried to reinforce the makeshift walls with bits of cloth and scrap plastic from our packs. It wasn't perfect, likely nowhere near as good as the advanced structures her people once built, but it felt like a step toward normalcy. When the sun dipped below the valley's rim, the air cooled, but not to the bone-freezing levels we'd known before. We shared the last of our scavenged rations, then boiled water from the stream to ensure it was safe enough to drink. In the flicker of a small campfire, Era sat across from me, hugging her knees. Her expression was pensive, almost shy. I found myself staring at her profile, the way her cheeks curved, the gentle slope of her shoulders. She caught my gaze and gave me a questioning look. My pulse quickened, but I mustered a small smile. "I'm just checking you're all right." She let out a soft laugh, tinged with self-consciousness. "I should be asking you that. You're the one who took a blade to the side." I touched the bandage. "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." She lowered her eyes for a moment. "Thank you," she repeated, then shook her head as though the words weren't enough. "You risked everything, and not just once." "I guess I don't learn my lessons," I teased, though the moment felt more serious than that. "Anyway, I'd rather have you around than not." She looked up, meeting my gaze. I saw vulnerability and hope in her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she said in a small voice. "I know it's dangerous, but I don't want to be alone anymore. If that means we fight together, so be it." My chest tightened. "Then stay," I whispered. She let out a shaky breath, and there was nothing more to say. I slid closer, gently brushing my fingertips along the back of her hand. She turned her palm over, lacing her fingers with mine, and in the glow of the fire, I felt more alive than I had in years. We slept under the makeshift shelter, side by side, with only the soft murmur of the stream and the hush of night to lull us. There were no distant gunshots, no howling wind to jar us awake. Ira's breathing steadied, and I let my eyes close, trusting that for once, tomorrow might not bring a new horror. When morning arrived, sunlight broke through clouds and gilded the treetops in gold. I awoke with a cramp in my leg, but a curious lightness in my chest. Ira was still curled beside me, her head resting on a folded coat. I pushed myself upright, stretching stiff limbs. The valley was strangely silent, as if nature itself held its breath. The stream's babbling and the gentle rustle of branches were the only sounds. We spent the early part of the day exploring our surroundings. The valley wasn't massive, but it had enough resources, saplings, small game trails, even a patch of edible berries if we were careful. I rigged a snare near a well-trodden path, hoping to catch a rabbit or something similar. Ira, for her part, found an odd cluster of mushrooms that she insisted were safe to eat, having recognized them from data stored in her suit's memory before it failed. Little by little, we began to piece together a new existence. It was precarious, sure, but it was more than either of us had dared hope for. During one afternoon, we sat by the stream, cleaning a handful of mushrooms. Era asked me about my old life, and I told her bits of it. Growing up in a city that no longer existed, joining the military out of youthful optimism, losing everything in a war that had no winners. She listened quietly, occasionally squeezing my hand when my voice cracked with old grief. Then she shared her own story of training among her people, of learning to handle advanced technology only to be disillusioned when the directive came to abandon Earth. She spoke of how she believed humans and aliens could have coexisted, but once the leaders deemed Earth lost, they decided to cut ties. Era tried to help a few humans escape disease-ridden camps, and that choice branded her a traitor. In her words, I heard an echo of the same despair that haunted me, a sense of failure, of being helpless to save the people she cared about. But we also shared a stubborn streak that refused to let us quit. That trait might have been what kept us both alive. That, and a bit of luck. At dusk, I coaxed a larger fire to life using the dried branches we'd collected. Ira nestled beside me, letting the warmth seep into her body. My side throbbed less these days, though it would likely leave a scar. I felt a strange contentment amid the uncertain future, as though the simple act of surviving together overshadowed all else. Era shifted closer, her voice hushed. "I never imagined finding peace here," she admitted. "Not after so much death." "Me neither," I said, gently laying a hand on her shoulder. "But it's good." She turned her head, meeting my eyes, and for a moment, the unspoken tension between us sparked. There was gratitude, yes, but also something deeper that had grown with each day of shared hardships. Without a word, she leaned in, pressing her forehead to mine in a gesture that felt simultaneously alien and intimately close. My breath caught. Slowly I slid my arms around her waist, and she relaxed into me. I wasn't sure if it was love or something else, but I knew neither of us wanted to let go. After everything we'd endured, this connection felt fragile, too precious to risk. When she finally pulled back, her cheeks were tinted that faint violet flush. I traced a thumb across her cheek, and she pressed her eyes shut as though savoring the gentle touch. The moment felt impossibly tender, foreign to a world that had become so cruel. Night came fully, and we retreated to the shelter, the weight of the day's labor pulling at our eyelids. Before drifting off, I found myself worrying about what might come next. Perhaps we would keep forging a life here, maybe even expand our little camp. Yet a sliver of dread reminded me that Rose and his soldiers might still roam. The explosion likely killed many, but there was no guarantee they wouldn't send more. Those thoughts slipped away as Era's breathing evened out near my side. I let sleep claim me, lulled by the sound of her presence. In the morning, we scouted further up the valley, discovering a small waterfall nestled behind a cluster of rocks. Its water cascaded into a deep pool, partially iced around the edges. The sight took my breath away, the beauty of it unspoiled by war. Era stared, equal wonder in her eyes. We agreed that if any place was safe enough to make a permanent home, it was here. We spent the next few days gathering materials for a sturdier structure. I scavenged large branches, using rope from old cargo straps to bind them into a frame. Era used a salvaged multi-tool from her belt, a leftover of her advanced gear, to shape the logs more precisely. We laughed at the awkward angles, the leaks that let cold air seep in. But it was ours, built with our own hands. The valley offered us animals to hunt carefully, plants to forage, and enough wood to keep a decent fire going. We improved day by day, learning each other's rhythms. I discovered that while she had more stamina than a human in certain conditions, she also fatigued quickly in the bitter cold. She learned that I didn't always speak when I was troubled, choosing instead to brood or slip into silence. Over time we adjusted, forging a wordless understanding. Occasionally I'd wake in the middle of the night, startled by a distant memory or a fleeting dream of gunfire. My heart would hammer until I felt Ira's warm presence beside me, and then I'd realize I was safe. Sometimes she'd bolt upright at a small sound, ready to flee until I calmed her. We had our scars, both visible and hidden, yet the valley provided a balm of solace. Weeks passed, maybe months. The sun's path shifted slightly, and the weather grew marginally less brutal. We never saw another sign of Ross's forces. Part of me feared that was a deception, that one day they'd come roaring into the valley. But as time slipped by, my worry dulled. The structure we built evolved into something like a cabin, with a patchy roof that kept out most snow and a simple door hinged with twisted metal scraps. We fashioned crude furniture from logs, arranged a cooking space near the fire pit, and even tested a small garden in a patch of soil where the snow had thawed. It was precarious, but it was ours. Era's eyes softened whenever she glanced at me. She no longer carried the posture of someone ready to bolt at the slightest threat. Instead, she grew comfortable, stepping outside in the mornings to gather water, humming a quiet tune I didn't recognize. Sometimes I watched her from the doorway, struck by the surreal truth that the alien I'd rescued in a battered tent had now become my closest companion. My partner in a sense. One evening, after we finished a meal of roasted hare and boiled roots, she rested her head against my shoulder by the fire. "I wish I could show you my world," she whispered, "what it was like before all this. It had such wonders." I pressed my cheek to the top of her head. "Maybe someday," I replied, though I couldn't fathom how we'd ever leave Earth, or if we even wanted to. The idea of traveling to the stars seemed as distant and unrealistic as it had ever been. But it didn't matter. She angled her head up, her violet gaze searching mine. "I don't think they'll come back for me," she said, "or for Earth. Our leaders gave up on this place. Even if some of my people are out there, I'm not sure I'm one of them anymore." I traced a gentle line along her arm. "You belong wherever you choose to belong. If that's here, then that's enough." Her lips curved into a small smile. "I choose here." She squeezed my hand. "And you?" For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and our steady breathing. I realized that if someone had told me months ago that I'd be living in a hidden valley with an alien woman I'd come to care for deeply, I would have laughed in their face. Now, it seemed the most natural thing in the world. Eventually, we rose and stepped outside, letting the cooler night air brush over us. The stars were out in full force, pinpricks of light across a sky no longer choked by city glow or pollution. Ira gazed upward, her expression distant. "Those are my home," she murmured. "I used to dream of them. Now I dream of this valley." I wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "This is our home now," I said quietly. She let out a breath that might have been a sigh of contentment. "Yes," she replied, voice like a gentle echo in the darkness. "And I won't let you go." We stood there a while, warmed not by technology or old illusions but by each other. The wind rustled the pine boughs overhead, carrying a promise that perhaps even in a world as broken as ours, something new could grow. And though the future remained uncertain, we faced it together, refusing to let fear drive us apart. After all, we had already survived impossible odds, and in that survival we found a fragile but resolute bond. When I finally guided her back inside our makeshift cabin, I realized that was the first time in my life I'd felt truly hopeful since the wars ended. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, maybe building a larger shelter, foraging deeper into the valley, or figuring out how to store supplies for the next winter. But we would meet those challenges head-on. We had a home, a reason to fight, and the knowledge that neither of us had to face it all alone again. I closed the door against the cool night, sealing in the soft glow of the fire. Era settled down beside me and I draped a blanket over her shoulders. The warmth in the cabin and the sound of her quiet breathing lulled me into a sense of security, rare in a place as harsh as this. She turned her head, eyes half-lidded, and whispered my name, as if it mattered, as if, in this lonely universe, it meant something. I murmured a reply, feeling the weight of that meaning. No one could say if the rest of humanity would ever rebuild, if her people might return, or if the planet would remain a husk of what it once was. But in that moment, I felt certain that even in the direst circumstances, life clung on. Compassion survived. And that, in itself, was enough to keep us going, bound by a fragile tenderness, forging a future from the ruins of our past. We drifted off to sleep side by side, no longer haunted by the emptiness we once knew. Tomorrow we would wake in the same small cabin, in the same hidden valley, grateful for another day. Our footsteps might lead us beyond the shelter eventually, to explore the edges of the new world we were making. But wherever we went, we would go hand in hand, unwilling to let the other out of sight. After all, I had taken in a starving alien woman who'd nearly frozen to death, and now she refused to let me go. Maybe that was the best thing that ever happened to me. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet hush of the valley cradle us, our hearts beating in unison as we faced whatever dawn would bring, together.